You are watching a BET News special, State of Our Union, Reproductive Rights. An exclusive conversation with Vice President Kamala Harris.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We are on the campus of Howard University in Washington, D.C., inside the Crampton Auditorium for this important BET News special. I'm Errin Haines, Editor-at-Large for the 19th News, an independent, nonprofit newsroom reporting on gender, politics, and policy. On the eve of the pivotal midterm elections, we wanted to hold a critical conversation on an issue that is important to so many Americans, especially Black and brown women, the state of reproductive rights. And there's a lot to discuss. So joining me tonight, let's welcome actress DeWanda Wise. DeWanda is the star of the upcoming Showtime series, 3 Women. Welcome, DeWanda. Thank you. And also with us, I am pleased to welcome a Howard University alum, the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. Welcome. Welcome. Okay. Yes. Well, please have a seat. Have a seat. Welcome to you both, and welcome back to Howard, Madam Vice President.
It's good to be home.
Yes. Okay, well, with that, let's get started. And Madam Vice President, I'm going to start with you because it does not seem hyperbolic to say that this is a critical moment in our nation's history on so many levels, but unquestionably with respect to women's reproductive rights. So we had the Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court precedent that was set in 1973, suddenly overturned this summer in 2022. I just want to start by asking you, how did we get here?
Well, let's first, I start with just acknowledging, to your point, what has just happened, which is the highest court in our land, the United States Supreme Court, the Court of Thurgood Marshall, just took a constitutional right that was recognized from the people of America, from the women of America. And on this subject, I think it's very important to also acknowledge one does not need to abandon their faith or deeply held beliefs to agree. The government should not be telling her what to do with her body. If she chooses, she will consult with her loved ones, with her pastor, her priest, or her rabbi. But this is about the government apparently deciding in so many states that they're in a better position to tell her what's in her best interest than she is to decide what is in her best interest. And I say on this issue, we need to take back the flag, because this is about freedom and liberty. Founding principles of our nation, freedom and liberty. And what we have seen happen as a result of this decision is that in states around our country, so-called leaders, extremist so-called leaders, are proposing and passing laws that would criminalize doctors, nurses, and healthcare providers. Literally, they are outlining jail time for these healthcare providers if they provide reproductive health care. We're seeing these so-called leaders propose and pass laws where there will be no exception for rape or incest. Now, a lot of my career I spent as a prosecutor, and as a prosecutor I specialized in violence against women and children. I specialized in child sexual assault cases. The idea that anyone who claims to be a leader would suggest that after an individual has survived such an act of violence and violation to their body, and then suggest that afterward that individual will still not have the ability, much less the authority, to make decisions about what happens next to their body. It's immoral. Immoral. And I was talking to some of our young leaders who are here today, and I said, we've, up until now, and many of us are children of parents who fought for civil rights and marched, including me, we defined the progress of our country in many ways, including that progress was measured by an expansion of rights. And now we are seeing, on so many issues, efforts to restrict rights. So understand what this means, not only for the individuals that will directly be impacted by that decision, but what it means in terms of a trajectory that we are apparently on, that is about regression, not progress.
Yeah, Madam Vice President, I just want to stay with you on that point for a minute, because you have been talking to the American people about the relationship between what has happened on the other side of this Supreme Court decision and the relationship between that freedom and the erosion of rights in this country. Why is it important for you to really make that connection for people? What is it that you want people to understand about what that connection is?
There's a pattern here. So I happen to love Venn diagrams. Yes, you know those three circles? So I brought props. I just have two, so bear with me. Venn diagram.
Let me hold it for you.
Wow. We are in the college.
So I asked my team, tell me from which states are we seeing attacks on individual freedoms as it relates to reproductive choice? From which states are we seeing attacks on freedom as it relates to the right to vote? From which states are we seeing attacks on freedom to marry the person you love? And you would not be surprised to see there is an intersection.
Yeah.
See what's at play. See what's at play. But here's the other thing that this tells us also. Not only to see what is happening and see the constellation of it all, right? What do these individual things describe as a picture? But herein also lies the opportunity to rededicate ourselves to the coalition, to bringing folks together who seemingly have nothing in common. Folks who've been fighting forever for voting rights, fighting forever for reproductive health rights, maternal health, fighting forever on LGBTQ rights, to bring folks together in coalition, to stand together, knowing that we all have so much more in common than what separates us, and that it is incumbent on each of us to make sure nobody has been made to fight alone. So I say to our leaders, and in particular our young leaders, if you look at the best movements in our country that have been about progress, one of the main ingredients of those movements has been coalition building.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So let's rededicate ourselves to that.
Yeah. DeWanda, you're sitting here, we're listening to the Vice President. I'm wondering, just to take a beat, so many people are processing this Supreme Court decision. Were you surprised by the court's ruling this summer? What was your reaction?
I was like, oh, I don't need to watch the season of The Handmaid's Tale. And I was definitely among those who just thought it was a law. So when Dobbs came down, it was that kind of disembodied moment of horror. But, I'm a Black woman, so kind of immediately that sense of, the text messages, the getting everyone, I've been meeting with like the same group since then, weekly, and it's exactly what you just described. It's doctors, it's lawyers, it's activists. My primary interest, this is a huge mental health issue, as you can imagine. So there's just this darkly beautiful sense of just trying to attack it from every angle and share as much information, as many resources and facts as possible.
Yeah, just trying to make sense of this in the many different ways, the many implications that this could have for our country and for so many millions of Americans across this country. Well, Madam Vice President, I have covered you as this administration is really kind of dealing with a lot of the issues that are facing this country, and yet as a reporter, I've also kind of watched you as you focus a lot of your time and energy on this particular issue in a way that really seems personal. Why is that?
You know this, Errin. My mother raised me and my sister. My mother had two goals in her life: to raise her two daughters and to end breast cancer. So my mother was a cancer researcher, one of the very few women, and certainly one of the very few women of color.
Yeah.
And from the earliest time of my life, I remember my mother fighting for the dignity of women in the healthcare system. Knowing that, and I became aware at a very early age, that that can't be taken for granted. I think we'll talk at some point about maternal health and maternal mortality. I was aware at my earliest ages that Black women, women of color, are treated differently in the healthcare system. Women are not taken seriously in the healthcare system. And so it is something that has been a part of my life and my way of thinking about what needs to be addressed since the earliest stages. And then just doing this work over the years and seeing, sadly, that yes, we have made some progress, but there's still so much work to do. And that's why it is so important that we have leaders who use their bully pulpit in a way that reminds people of their rights and just clears up the misconceptions and the confusion. Because the worst thing that anyone can experience is to feel alone and unsure of who is there for them and what is available to them in terms of help. One of the most powerful things that we do is to remind people they are not alone, they are not being judged, there is help. We are a community of people who have compassion and empathy. That's one of the most important things I think we can do right now, in addition to this fight and the work. Right.
Absolutely. Coming up, we are going to discuss those real-world implications of the Supreme Court's decision, specifically on the lives of Black and brown women. We've still got a lot to unpack here, so stay with Welcome back. We are here with actress DeWanda Wise and Vice President Kamala Harris. So, Madam Vice President, I want to pick up on what we were talking about before the break, because with this ruling, I mean, even as a journalist that's trying to cover these issues day to day, it can be hard to follow these laws that are really pretty fast changing. So I'm wondering what you can say about the status of reproductive rights across the country right now.
Well, it's varied. And what we're seeing is that different states are proposing different approaches. But what I can tell you is that people are very confused, and so it is important that we are clear about their rights. The other issue that I'm seeing as I travel the country is for those states who have maintained the rights of people to make this decision for themselves, they are in a neighborhood geographically, many of them, where the states around them have restricted rights. So what we're also seeing is in those states that have maintained and protected these rights, they're seeing an influx of people, and it is putting a burden on their system. The other concern that I think we all have is what this means for so many people in terms of that if they don't have these rights in their own state, they have to travel. So that's the cost of a bus ticket, a train ticket, a plane ticket. We know the majority of women who receive these services are mothers.
Right.
So that means childcare. If they are fortunate enough to work somewhere that gives them paid family leave, maybe they'll be okay, or paid sick leave. But otherwise, they're looking at losing pay and income. And so what this means in terms of the additional layers of burden that are being put on people and the unfairness of it all is pretty extreme. I've convened, for example, university presidents to talk also about, for students, college students, community college students, what are they doing in terms of ensuring that their students will not be penalized if they're in a state that does not provide access to reproductive care? What are they providing so that those students will not be docked for absenteeism, unexcused? What it will mean in terms of, again, the legal liability that so many people are concerned about. Thankfully, the United States Department of Justice has pulled together a task force, and part of the work that they are doing is convening pro bono lawyers, so lawyers who will provide their legal services for free, because so many healthcare providers, people who work at clinics, are also unsure of what they're going to be exposed to in terms of legal liability. And that raises an additional issue among the many, which is the amount of threats that people who provide these services are enduring.
DeWanda, I want to come to you and just ask, what about you? What are you hearing from your family, from your friends, from folks in the community, just really in terms of their fears and concerns and thoughts about what these real world implications are on the other side of this ruling?
I mean, horror stories. One of the earliest stories was a doctor, Dr. Caitlin Bernard, who was being threatened in every way, legally, physically, for providing care to a 10-year-old rape victim, And so really pooling these kind of resources together to just be all hands on deck, and provide support. But you really don't need to look far. You asked Madam VP what her personal connection was, and before my mother had my brother and I, she had a ectopic pregnancy. Thank you, ectopic pregnancy. And it was one of those things where I knew it peripherally growing up, but really didn't, it didn't hit until the last several months. And it wasn't even a matter of being oh, I wouldn't be here, which is, wild to be I physically wouldn't be here. But just even thinking about a world where Margie Matthews isn't here, is really wild to me. So now, part of the protection and the federal protection is ensuring that even those emergency procedures are protected everywhere, because they're coming under attack too. And those are life-saving. When we talk about the mortality rate for Black women,
Absolutely.
it's just, it's absolutely unthinkable.
Well, DeWanda, you're making a point that, certainly I think all of us as Black women know, and that is that access to reproductive care is not just about access to legal and safe abortion care. And sadly, we do know that maternal mortality does disproportionately impact Black women. Madam Vice President, I know I don't have to say that to you, because throughout your tenure, you have been very focused on addressing these disparities, on trying to really address that inequality. And so I just wonder if you can talk about how the administration, how you are thinking about this, what the administration is doing about that work, particularly in this moment.
Well, on the issue of maternal mortality, Black women are 3 times more likely to die in connection with childbirth. Native women, twice as likely. Women who live in rural America, 1.5 times more likely. On the issue of Black maternal mortality, the facts are clear. It literally has nothing to do with her socioeconomic level or her education level. It has everything to do with the fact that when she walks into that clinic, that doctor's office, or that hospital, she is not taken as seriously.
Yes.
So when I was in the Senate, I proposed a bill that would address the racial bias component of this and require training of healthcare providers on the issue of racial bias. And this issue of maternal mortality, it also causes me to pause and to consider that the hypocrisy of these so-called leaders who want to say that they are for life, but where have they been on the issue of maternal mortality?
Yeah.
Where have they been?
Yeah.
Absent. And, but it is an issue that is about, it's the need for advocacy, the need to have what might be difficult conversations for some, but must be had around the disparities in our healthcare system in general, based on income and based on race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I may, my mother is a minister in a Methodist church.
Yes.
And their position in the Methodist church is it's for mothers. It's pro-life. It is for the life of the women whose lives are in danger. Yeah. And I just think that's huge.
Yeah. Such an important and ongoing conversation that I know you'll continue to have, Madam Vice President. Well, we have just heard a bit about what your administration is doing, but also what can people, especially young people and people of color, what can they do to make change? Let's discuss that after the break. Welcome back. I'm Errin Haines, editor-at-large for the 19th, and we are at Howard University in Washington, D.C., continuing our conversation with the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, and actress DeWanda Wise. We're discussing reproductive rights and the upcoming midterm election. So, Madam Vice President, we started our show really talking about the shock that many people felt when Roe was overturned. And certainly many people that I've talked to during this election felt like that moment was really a wake-up call, that many of the rights that we take for granted are under attack. What can you say about what else is at stake, and really what can they do to respond?
Well, as it relates specifically to the Dobbs decision, Justice Clarence Thomas said the quiet part out loud. In his concurring opinion, so as part of the opinion, he said, well, his interpretation of the Constitution suggests that what also is at risk is your right to contraception. Your right to marry the person you love. And understand again, when we are talking about these kinds of attacks on right to privacy, right? It comes from a belief that there are certain things that an individual should be able to decide for themselves. I think of these issues as the issues that relate to heart and home. That your government should not be making those decisions for you. And so this all is potentially under attack. And again, going back to the intersection in terms of which states are attacking which rights, and to see that overlap between voting rights. I mean, you look at a state like Georgia, and I know how I feel about that election, and I hope everyone feels strongly about it too. Where, laws are being passed in our country that would literally make it against the law to give somebody food and water while they're standing in line to exercise their civic responsibility to vote. Laws that are being passed that are intentionally making it more difficult for people to vote. And my theory of the case is this. In 2020, people turned out in record numbers, as some of us have discussed, in the middle of a pandemic. Turned out in record numbers to vote. Young voters, historic number, turned out to vote. And basically said what they wanted from their country and their future. I think that scared some people. So they started passing these laws, making it more difficult for you to vote. Suggesting we would eliminate, in some cases, drop boxes, early voting, vote by mail. And so these are the kinds of rights that are being attacked. You look at what's happening in terms of the attacks that are grounded in hate against members of the LGBTQ community. You look at what's happening in terms of these so-called leaders pounding their chest as though the measure of strength is based on who you beat down, when the true measure of strength is based on who you lift up.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, just to stay with you on that point, and we are seeing young people really in the wake of all of these voter suppression laws that we're seeing passed around the country, young people across America voting in record numbers already headed into the home stretch of these midterm elections. But I know you've also spoken about coalition building as a key part of the solution. Why is it that is such a critical piece of how you are thinking about all of this?
I just strongly believe nobody should be made to fight alone, especially when they are fighting for their rights. And the coalition is about recognizing that the vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us. And, you know, that old saying, there is power in unity. It's about the collective, right? And the power of the collective to exercise their rights. And I think there is nothing stronger, because truly when you think about the rights that are being attacked, the folks who are most at risk do have so much in common in terms of a number of things that are about the vulnerability to the attacks, but I'd say about something that is also incredibly strong, which is that the fight for each of these things is about the fight for our country to achieve its ideals. You know, I think it's important, you know, when we remember the fight for civil rights, the fight for human rights, the fight for equal rights, this is about challenging our nation to achieve its ideals. And I think there could be no greater act of patriotism as an expression of the love for our country than to fight for our country to achieve its ideals, ideals that were based on the principle of equality and freedom, and liberty and justice.
And DeWanda, I see you nodding your head too. I mean, what do you see can be done as an ordinary citizen? What are you doing?
I feel like, you know, my favorite reminder to everyone is that socio-historically in the United States, all movements have been youth movements. That's right. Like we've only ever seen photos of Harriet Tubman when she was kind of done, but she was 27.
Yeah.
She was 27 and she did it without the internet.
Well, that too. There was no internet.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So really, you know, the first step is staying inspirited, you know, and the timing of this was really intentional in my opinion, because it was, you know, over the summer, by the time we reached this point where I need you all to get out and vote, they knew that folks were gonna be tired. They knew, you know, that inflation was inflation and it was gonna be inflationing. They knew that there were gonna be all these other issues, because there have been, obviously, for the past 3 years that, you know, would take precedent, and they're banking on the fact that we would forget and get tired. But as much as they speak about, you know, what's in our DNA and there's trauma in our DNA, there's also a lot of fight and resiliency and stamina in our DNA.
Indeed. Okay, well, that's a good note to take a break on, but when we come back, reproductive rights are not just a women's issue. So where do men fit into this? Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Errin Haines, here with Vice President Kamala Harris and actress DeWanda Wise. So we've already talked about women's health and the work to protect women's reproductive rights, but I do think that some men that are watching this conversation maybe don't grasp how this conversation impacts them. So I want to give both of you an opportunity to talk about that now. DeWanda, I'll come to you first and ask you, why should the fight for women's health and reproductive rights matter to men?
Oh, let's talk about it. So I've taken anatomy and biology, and as far as I know, how children are conceived, it's usually a family choice. Turns out. And as Madam VP was saying before, so many of the women who are seeking this care already have children. It's not the statistics or the cliche or the stereotypes that we're being fed, right? It's families. This is a family decision. And in terms of the intersectionality of it, it impacts so many other sections of society that we're all a part of, right? When you don't have adequate reproductive care for women, businesses suffer. Statistically, businesses, I'm talking the education system, we're talking our foster care system. There's so many other industries that are impacted that men are integral, a part of, running as they do. So, it is our issue. And thankfully, like I said in the conversations that I've been having in the last 4 months, there are organizations, there's Men for Choice, that's really kind of like stomping the yard and getting the messaging out and creating a space for men to convene and really educate themselves and become true allies, like active allies in the fight. So that's really inspiriting.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, we know that men are already weighing in on this issue, right? But we also know that all issues are women's issues, and women's issues can be everyone's issue.
We can all be feminists.
If we ask them about this. So, Madam Vice President, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Well, I agree. I think that also, if you have a sister or a niece or an auntie or a mother, or you get my point, the people in your life are potentially directly impacted by it. So that is another point. And I think one of the most profound points is this. When people start coming at someone and to take away their rights, we're all vulnerable. It'll just be a minute before they come for some of your rights. So let's not let this train leave the station. Or let's slow it down right now before it goes to the next place. And that's about just seeing what's at play here. And again, back to the point about what Clarence Thomas said. So if you are, if you are a man and you have exercised your right to contraception, that right might very well be at risk. If you are in a same-sex relationship, that is very much at risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not to mention, as we talked about, the allyship and why we should all protect the rights of each other, understanding that ultimately it is about our nation. Because I'll also say this, Errin. As Vice President, I have now met directly or by phone with 100 world leaders.
Yeah. Wow.
So presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, kings. And one of the things about the United States is that we have traditionally had the ability to walk in those rooms and have those conversations, chin up, shoulders back, talking about what it means to represent the strongest democracy in the world, imperfect though we may be. But it gives us the authority then to walk in those rooms and talk about human rights, rule of law. But the thing about being a model then, everyone here knows, when we are role models, people will watch what you do to see if it matches what you say. So my great fear is, in addition to all that we have talked about that is at play, there will be dictators and autocrats around the world who will say to their people who are fighting for these rights, well, you want to hold the United States out as an example? Look what they're doing. You be quiet. And in that way, there is a real potential in this moment for the issues that we have discussed to not only affect the American people, but people around the world.
Yeah.
And that is what we have to understand is the magnitude and the span of all of this in terms of the various rights and who is potentially vulnerable.
Yeah, not just implications for this country, but globally, there are implications. Yeah, so we need to take another break, but when we come back, we're gonna have some final thoughts about what's at stake in these midterm elections. Stay with us. Welcome back. And final thoughts now with actress DeWanda Wise and Vice President Kamala Harris. So tomorrow is Election Day, and we always hear that voting is important, that this is an important election, but this election really does seem more consequential, especially after the conversation that three of us have just had. So I want to give each of you a final word really about the importance of tomorrow's election and the importance of voting. And DeWanda, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I understand being and feeling disillusioned, and the fear that your vote doesn't matter. But clearly, the night before is an opportune moment to just remind us that every freedom that we have, every freedom that we take for granted, this one that I absolutely did myself, just a couple of months ago, completely wasn't thinking about it. That we fought for, that we voted for in this country. And that's what's at stake tomorrow, to just go out and exercise that right that many of our ancestors fought for. I know you hear that a lot, but really just taking a moment tonight to internalize what that means, that there are those who in our families, outside of our families, gave their lives for this right, to exercise this right that we have tomorrow. And so I know you're tired, but, get a good night's rest, get up and head to those polls.
Yeah, absolutely. And take somebody with you. Madam Vice President, the last word goes to you.
Well, I mean, DeWanda said it, but here's the thing. It's a power that we each have to vote. It's a power that in the many ways we use our voice, that is one of them. And I strongly believe you should never let anybody take your power from you. Don't let anybody take your power from you. And I guess my final point would be this. We've been talking a lot about democracy, and democracy is on the ballot. And here's the thing. I think that the nature of democracies is that it's kind of, there's a duality to it. On the one hand, when democracies are intact, they're extremely strong in what they do to fight for and defend people's rights, right? Your rights, your right to be, your right to equality, your right to freedom. When they are intact, they're strong in terms of what they give to protect and defend individual rights. On the other hand, it's very fragile, democracy. It will only be as strong as our willingness to fight for it. And so fight we must. Fight we will. Every right, every freedom we have attained so far was because we were willing to fight for it, born out of love of our country and our knowledge that when we fight, we win. That's it.
So with that, I want to thank Howard University for hosting this critical conversation. And also thank you to DeWanda Wise and to Vice President Kamala Harris for being here with us. Everybody make sure that your voice is heard. Get out there and vote. Have a good night.